Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Good morning again. We welcome you to our study this morning in the Word. Last week was, of course, Easter, and today we begin two lessons on post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. Last week we were in the Gospel of Luke. This morning we switched to the Gospel of John for two lessons, and we'll be looking during the next two Sundays, today and next Sunday, at one chapter only, the last chapter of the Gospel of John. Lee, I've always been puzzled by the way John seems to have two endings, an ending at the end of chapter 20 and an ending at the end of chapter 21.
Yeah.
Say a word about that, if you would.
The last two verses of chapter 20 sound like a conclusion. He says there are a lot of things written in this book, but there could be a lot more. We know a lot more about Jesus, but I've picked the stories that would help people come to faith. And I think
so. There's a purpose for writing this gospel.
There's a clearly stated purpose, as there is with the Gospel of Luke. So if that's the conclusion, why do we have chapter 21? Well, it's a kind of conclusion to the main body of the Gospel of John, where he has told us stories about people coming to faith. And he just told us one of the most amazing faith stories with Jesus' encounter with Thomas, one of his disciples.
Doubting Thomas.
Yeah, who said, I won't believe unless I have proof that it's the risen Lord, the really risen Lord.
In other words, he is, you might say, a secularist. He wants proof by one or more of the senses.
Yeah, although, I don't fault Thomas too much because he demanded proof of the resurrection, and I'm really grateful for that because yes, if the resurrection had just been the wishful thinking of Jesus' followers, then our faith would be based on a wish.
Yeah.
But Thomas actually asked for evidence, and yeah, you could call that a secular spirit or a modern spirit, but I'm kind of grateful at the same time. At any rate, Thomas's faith was confirmed that day.
Yes.
And so the last two verses of chapter 20 say, this is just another in the long line of faith stories that I wanted to tell in this gospel.
Right.
Then chapter 21, which we're studying today and next week, becomes kind of an epilogue, kind of an added chapter, which is very appropriate for the gospel.
It seems to have a prologue.
It has a prologue.
At the beginning of chapter 1.
It does, in chapter 1, before he gets into the faith stories. So it feels like it has two conclusions, but I think there's a logical reason for that.
I like so much the statement at the end of the Thomas story, at the end of chapter 20. Blessed are those, Thomas said, I won't believe unless I can touch the wounds and see them and so forth. And so Jesus appears and he gets to touch and feel and see. And Jesus makes a comment about that, and he says, and this comment fits us today. Have you come to faith by virtue of seeing and feeling and touching? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe.
And that's us. That's us. That's good. And the other great thing about the Thomas story is he uttered one of the most profound statements of faith ever. When he saw the risen Lord, with his own eyes, he said, "My Lord and my God." I mean,
Yes.
That's an amazing statement of faith. So that's the Thomas story, and it's what immediately precedes the post-resurrection stories that we're going to be studying these next 2 weeks.
Yes.
Well, let me read the one that we're going to talk about today. It's at the beginning of chapter 21. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It's the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead.
And next Sunday's lesson will pick right up.
Yes,
and continue the story.
Continue the very same story.
So we don't dare deal with the conclusion of the story.
No, we'll save that.
We have to save it.
Save that.
Okay.
Well, back to the first verse. The very first word, "afterward," refers back to appearances of Jesus in chapter 20.
Well, and the last verse, 14, also refers to them. As a matter of fact, when you go back, this is the 3rd appearance of Jesus to his disciples.
To a group of disciples.
In a group of disciples in John.
Yes, there was the appearance without Thomas, the appearance with Thomas, and this makes
now
the
this
3rd.
one in Galilee.
Chapter 20 also includes an appearance of Jesus to an individual, Mary Magdalene.
Right.
Yeah. Now,
what about the name of the body of water?
Yeah.
We all know it as the Sea of Galilee.
We do. Actually, the Gospel of John calls that body of water the Sea of Tiberias, and that is the word that John actually used in the Greek text here.
Right.
The NIV has put in Galilee because we know what the Sea of Galilee is, and Tiberias might have been confusing. That lake had a number of names throughout history. In Old Testament times, it was Chinnereth or Kinneret, okay.
Yeah, in the Old Testament, whenever you see a CH combined, pronounce it like a K. Except in Rachel and in cherubim. Otherwise, it's always K.
Okay. At any rate, and then it was called Gennesaret and Galilee. But then in Roman times, Herod renamed it Tiberias in honor of the emperor.
Emperor Tiberius.
Yeah, and built a beautiful city.
And it was on the western shore, about halfway down the western side of the little lake.
The city of Tiberias.
Yes.
And then the lake started getting called Tiberias as well. But it's the Sea of Galilee.
I don't think the city is ever referred to in the Bible. I don't think I
don't believe
remember.
it is. I don't believe it is. It was down near Magdala, where Mary Magdalene came from.
Yeah.
Well, we have 7 disciples here, according to verse 2, right?
Yes.
We have Simon Peter and the sons of Zebedee, who were the fishermen disciples.
And those are James and John.
Right. Then we have Thomas, who...
He is in both stories.
Yeah.
Back in chapter 20, of course, in a very big way. And now,
that was down in Jerusalem, and now he's part of the group of...
Now, he's called Didymus. Now, what does that mean?
Twin.
Ditto?
Well, you kind of ditto. It means twin.
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 And the question is, he must have looked like somebody in the group. Now,
either that or he had a biological twin and
Okay.
just got, my wife has twin aunts, and they were referred to almost their whole life as the twins, which is a little bit sad because you lose your identity. But
well, my grandmother, or my father's mother was an identical twin, Miss Ada and Miss Ida.
All right. Well, at any rate, in fact, the word Thomas itself may have some connection to the word twin, right?
Thomas, yeah.
So, twin. Then Nathanael's calling to be a disciple is told in the first chapter of the Gospel of John.
Right.
And
Does
so
he have
he's
another
mentioned.
name? Do you remember?
Well, the problem is that in some of the other Gospels, Nathanael is not mentioned, but Bartholomew is mentioned. And Bartholomew is not mentioned in the Gospel of John. That has led us to guess that Bartholomew may have been another name for Nathanael.
Right.
But if so, he had a mouthful of a name, Nathanael Bartholomew. At any rate, that's a possibility. And then 2 other disciples, we don't know.
They're not
who
named.
And they don't even necessarily have to be out of the 12.
Right.
Because the
Right.
word disciple was used more broadly than the 12.
Yes.
Now, what do you make of Peter's statement in verse 3, I'm going out to fish? There's a difference of opinion about how we should understand that.
Absolutely. Well, the way in which it's worded in the NIV almost sounds like Peter is frustrated. They've gone from Jerusalem all the way back up to Galilee, to their fishing grounds, and and they're troubled, and things have not turned out the way they want, and Peter is messed up, obviously, and that's going to come out very clearly in next week's lesson, and so some have, I guess, taken this to be frustration. And what the heck, I'm going to go out and fish and forget it.
Yeah. If Jesus isn't going to show up, the heck with it. I'm just going back to being a fisherman.
Yeah.
Forget this disciple thing.
On the other hand, it does not have to be understood that way. The way the words are used here in the English translation of the NIV, words carry, besides meaning, they carry baggage. And the baggage, that the way this is worded seems to me to be a negative kind of expression. But I think you looked at the Greek.
Yeah, it just says...
It doesn't necessarily mean that.
It literally says, I'm going to be fishing.
And it's kind of a neutral statement.
It could be, yeah, just, I'm waiting for Jesus. I'm patient. I'm glad to wait for Jesus as long as it takes for him to show up. I'll be fishing. Just, if Jesus shows up, tell him I'm out fishing.
Well, and it looks like he thinks he's going to go by himself.
Originally, yes. And then they say, well, we need something to do as well. I think the disciples have been obedient so far. They were told to go back to Galilee and to wait there for Jesus. So they have gone to Galilee and they are waiting for Jesus. So I don't see any necessity of interpreting this in a negative way. Jesus himself said the best way to wait is by working,
Yeah.
by being about the task. And so here they are being useful fishing. So
Yes.
but that is interpreted different ways. As you mentioned, the others decide they're going to go with him as well. Now, it says that night they caught nothing. Oh, if they were stupid enough to fish at night, no wonder they caught nothing. That's the way I would respond to it.
I don't know.
But no,
they did not fish by a line.
Right. They fished at night back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did. And
they fished with nets.
They fished with nets, and they would sometimes hang a lantern off the bow of their boat in the middle of the night, and that would draw fish up to the surface.
Yeah.
So it's not a silly thing. That's when they fished. Now, verse 4 is reminiscent of resurrection morning, isn't it? Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore. It's kind of like early in the morning, the women went to the empty tomb. But the disciples didn't realize it was Jesus. Now, it seems to me that there are all kinds of good reasons why they wouldn't have immediately figured out that this was Jesus. We talked about this a little bit last week with the two on the road to Emmaus.
Right.
The lack of recognition.
And here, there are parallels between this story and the Emmaus story, but there's one very strong difference between them. Once they figured it was Jesus in the house in Emmaus, he vanished.
Yeah.
But Jesus did not vanish once he was recognized here by his disciples on this occasion.
Many of the stories of Jesus' encounters with his followers after the resurrection have this theme of a crisis of recognition. Are they going to recognize him or not?
Yes.
And I think that's a very important theme. Remember, when Mary was at the tomb, after Peter and John had come and gone, she's in the garden crying, and Jesus shows up and speaks to her, and she just assumes it's a gardener who's come.
Yes.
And in her sadness, and then Jesus calls her by name, and when that registers, she knows it's Jesus.
Yes.
And there's a moment of realization.
Yes.
The same thing happens with Thomas. I mean, it's different, but there's a moment of recognition when he sees Jesus with his scars.
And so it is the two on the way to Emmaus.
Two on the way to Emmaus. And now we get it yet again. And I think the gospel writers emphasize that theme for a good reason. And that is that there was no confusion. Jesus was not some apparition. Jesus was not just some mental, dream that people had. They really struggled with recognizing him, and they really did then recognize him.
Right.
Well, what was it that caused them to recognize Jesus in this instance?
This is very, very interesting part of the story because, first of all, it is the disciple whom Jesus loved, and we are assuming that is John.
That's the normal assumption,
son of Zebedee.
Yeah.
And he says in verse 7, the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, only to Peter, "It is the Lord."
Yeah.
Peter, hearing that, then wraps his outer garment around himself and jumps overboard and starts swimming to shore. I guess the other 5 must have wondered, what's that fool doing?
Typically impetuous, but they don't know why. Huh? Yeah.
And then, as the story unfolds further, Peter gets back on board the ship when this fellow on shore tells him, bring some fish.
I need some fish. So here Peter is wading, splashing back and forth.
Yeah. And then in verse none of them, of the disciples, dared ask him, "Who are you?" For they knew it was the Lord.
That's verse 12. So now they've all come to full recognition.
Yeah.
The question in my mind is, what caused John to initially think, oh, this must be Jesus? And I think we've got a couple of possibilities. One thing, when they just saw him standing there in the early morning light, here it is dawn, dawn, they're out on the water, there may have been a haze or a mist or a fog or whatever. They didn't recognize him by sight. But when he hears his voice, that may have helped
the sound
with
of
the
the
recognition.
voice.
And
I think that's how Mary recognized
I think it is partly, I agree. And also what he called them. Now the NIV says friends in verse 5, but the actual word is my little children. It's not the word friends, my little children. And that is a term that Jesus typically used for his followers. So I think that word may have helped him.
Right.
And then there's the miracle, and this is, I assume, a miracle here. Throw your net on the right side, and you'll find some, and they...
Well, the same thing had happened before.
It's very similar.
With Jesus in the boat.
When he called them to be his disciples.
Yeah.
Yeah. Back in Luke chapter 5, right after calling Peter, Andrew, James, and John to be disciples, they went out in the boat and didn't catch anything, and Jesus said, we'll put out into deeper water, and then they caught this huge catch of fish.
Yeah.
And I think the parallel of the similar incidents is the thing that confirmed it in John's mind.
So John recognized the voice and the parallel event.
I think so.
And let's face it, we will learn in the next week's lesson that John was the one who was very close to Jesus. Mm-hmm. And in fact, as Jesus was dying on the cross, he committed his mother's welfare to John.
Right.
There's no question about that. The same one of the disciples, and we do know that John did take care of Mary at Ephesus.
That's
later on, much later in life.
Yeah. Verse 9 is interesting. Jesus already has a little fire going, and he already has some food, a few fish and some bread, and he's already fixing breakfast for them when they arrive on shore. This begins a series of verses which are very reminiscent to me of the feeding of the 5,000.
Yes.
Where Jesus did have bread and fish. Yes. And supplies them. Not a massive amount of people, but I think that repetition of an event might also have helped cement in their minds that this really is Jesus.
There is, in fact, in Israel today, a church that memorializes this event. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, it was, marked up and. But it's been repaired.
Yeah. Some people might wonder about the exact number of fish that's mentioned in verse 11.
We say something about it. We don't have much time, but this is really curious.
This has led to all kinds of theories about why the number 153 is here. And these are theories among early Christians who were trying to make something symbolic of this. One said it's the number of species of fish that are in the world, and that they were all in the Sea of Galilee. That's unlikely. Some people try to do kind of a numerological thing here and do 10 plus 7 times 3 times 3 for the Trinity, and they end up with 153. There are all kinds of symbolic attempts to explain it. The one that might make some sense is that ancient people believed that there were 153 nations in the world, people groups, tribal groups, and that this would have been Jesus' way of saying, I want my apostles, my disciples, to reach out to all the people of the world.
Right.
We know that Jesus thought that.
Yes.
From the Great Commission.
Sure.
The other possibility, of course, is that this just was the literal number of fish. And you say, no fisherman I ever saw would catch a big net of fish and then sit down and count them. But it is possible that if this was the biggest...
I know some fishermen who
would.
Yes,
and then brag about it, right?
And brag about it. Yes.
There were this many fish.
And they were that.
And they were large, it says, right?
And they were large, but, and they got...
Yeah.
With time, they got larger.
They got even bigger. Well, at any rate, I love this fact that Jesus is kind of repeating the feeding of the 5,000, but with this intimate group of disciples to try to give them confidence.
Yes.
It's really me.
Well, and when you think of the feeding of the 5,000, you can't help but think of the spiritual food that Christ provides with the body and the blood, and which is again in John's gospel.
That's good that you connect it to the Lord's Supper.
Yes,
I think
exactly.
I think that's important. Well, one of the things that is so important to me about this passage is that after the resurrection, you know, the disciples had really struggled with Jesus' decision to go to the cross, with the reality of his resurrection. And what Jesus has orchestrated here is kind of a back to the beginning or a back to basics thing, where he says, I'll tell you what, this has all been so shocking. Let's just go back to Galilee. Meet me there.
That's where we started.
That's where we started. Meet me beside the lake.
Yes.
And let's just start this all over again, kind of fresh. And the fishermen are back fishing, and Jesus shows up on the shore, and there's a miracle of the catch of fish to confirm his power. And I think it's a wonderful way. And you know, there are times when we're kind of called back to the beginning, when we get so busy, even in ministry or in our lives, or maybe fall into a period of doubt. I remember I was in a period of doubt once when I was in graduate school, and the way I dealt with it was I went jogging every morning, and I said, okay, I'm just going to go back to basics. Do I believe in God? And the first morning, I ended my jog, said, well, yes, I do. And I went back to basics like that.
Right.
And I think Jesus is kind of rebuilding them from the beginning here in a way that might actually apply to us at times in our lives.
Yes. Well, I found another track in which the disciples withdrew, but came back and tried again, and then came recognition of Jesus. Finally, out of all of that, and then once Jesus was recognized, it made sense out of everything, and then they moved on, and we'll see that conclusion in next Sunday.
Yeah, more feeding.
More feeding, yes. We're so happy that you would be with us, and we do hope you'll come back to hear the end of the story, the rest of the story next week, because it is a profound ending to this particular story. God bless you this week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.